The Polish president has made a U-turn on the missile crisis after initially blaming Moscow. President Duda now says he has no evidence that the missile, which fell in eastern Poland, killing 2 locals, was launched by the Russian military. He's also admitted that Ukraine's air defences were likely responsible for the incident.
Most likely, it was a Russian-made S-300 missile. At the moment, we have no evidence that it was a missile fired by the Russian side. Much indicates that it was an air defense missile, which unfortunately fell on the territory of Poland.
NATO's chief has also doubled down on the fact there's nothing to implicate Russia in the incident, which was apparently caused by a Ukrainian missile. The leader of the US-led bloc also says Moscow is clearly not trying to target the alliance.
We have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack. And we have no indication that Russia is preparing offensive military actions against NATO. The incident was likely caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile fired to defend Ukrainian territory against Russian cruise missile attacks. But let me be clear. This is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears ultimate responsibility as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine.
Kiev, meanwhile, refuses to accept that the missile came from Ukraine, demanding its representatives are allowed to visit the site to investigate. RT's Donald Courter takes a closer look at the controversy.
This appears to indicate that Warsaw may be more interested in just pointing the finger at Russia and risking an all-out global war than it actually is interested in getting down to the facts as to whose weapons actually killed 2 Polish citizens in this impact near the border. Because let's not forget, Poland began to imply that this was Russia's fault after it began saying that these missiles that landed there were, or rather missiles were actually Russian-made. And after giving in to all this hysteria, giving rise to it in the Western media among Western politicians, it only then said it was going to have an emergency meeting to discuss what is actually known about the situation and then decide what to do from there. So naturally, this evoked a not-so-nice reaction from Moscow. We heard from the Kremlin spokesman who said, basically, why didn't Warsaw just tell the truth to begin with?
Poland could have immediately told the truth about the missile incident. Then everyone would have immediately understood that Russia had nothing to do with it.
But second of all, we have to think about the timing of all this, because Warsaw's reaction actually came just moments after we got reports that Joe Biden was saying that this was likely a Ukrainian missile that hit in Polish territory and killed those 2 people. So now we have a situation where basically Washington and Warsaw are actually towing the line of the Russian government, because we also heard from Russia's defense ministry. They said that the rockets that were shown, or the remnants of the missiles that were shown in the pictures that came out from that territory, were actually indicative of surface-to-air missiles that came from a Soviet-made missile air defense system that was only used by the Ukrainian military. So that's definitely something interesting to take into account here. We're talking about S-300 missiles, which, by the way, are S-300 missile systems, rather, which, by the way, cannot even hit ground targets. Instead of waiting for any of the information to come out, basically, after this became known, we heard from Ukrainian officials immediately pointing the finger at Russia. We heard from Ukraine's foreign minister, who on Twitter said that the now widely accepted story of events, which is that a Ukrainian missile fell on Polish territory, was a conspiracy theory that Russia was spreading around. That's what Ukraine's foreign minister said. And we also heard from Vladimir Zelensky, who said that there should be consequences, there should be action taken against Russia for this. I mean, it was as if that the Ukrainian president was ready to sacrifice his entire country in a third world war over this.
How many times has Ukraine said that the actions of the terrorist state will not be limited to our country alone? Hitting NATO territory with missiles, this is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a really significant escalation. Action is needed.
Russia now promotes a conspiracy theory that it was allegedly a missile of Ukrainian air defense that fell on the Polish theory, which is not true. No one should buy Russian propaganda or amplify its messages. This lesson should have been long learnt since the downing of #MH17.
Now, it's also important to note that right after all this took place, we started hearing talk among Western politicians and in the Western media about NATO potentially invoking Articles 4 or 5 of its charter. And just to give our viewers an idea of what that is, Article 5 of the charter says an armed attack against one shall be considered an attack against all. So as this story was unraveling and it became clearer and clearer that it was likely Kiev was to blame for this, many were wondering if NATO would come down on Kiev as hard as it would on Moscow. But based on Stoltenberg's recent comments, it's clearly not going to be the case. Immediately after this happened, we started seeing headlines saying that this was a Russian attack on Polish territory. And there was no shortage of sensationalism either. We saw headlines saying that it was a shocking act on behalf of Russia, some saying that this is going to be a lead up to a third world war. One even said that Russia had bombed Poland. And also on Western television screens, there was no shortage of this kind of hysteria either.
NATO here shouldn't be restrained, at least in its language, in its message to Russia.
Would the U.S. need to adjust its force posture there?
And there is actually a lot that NATO could do.
And this is, in fact, exactly the kind of scenario that journalists like myself have been posing to NATO. What exactly does it mean that you will defend every inch of the alliance territory? So that's going to be put to the test now.
What would that mean now for this conflict and whether it now spills toward elicits a reaction from NATO?
These kinds of reports, they're definitely shocking, but actually not very surprising, because throughout Russia's special military operation, we've kind of seen Western media just blindly parroting what Kiev is saying about the conflict without doing any sort of critical examination of that information. So here again, we see this, the same kind of thirst for a third world war that came out of Kiev is seen basically republished in the Western media.
NATO's Baltic members have been singing the same tune as Ukraine, accusing Russia of directly attacking bloc member Poland.
Russian missiles hitting the territory of the NATO member is a very dangerous escalation by the Kremlin. Latvia expresses full solidarity with our ally Poland and will support any action deemed appropriate by Poland. Russia will bear full responsibility for all the consequences.
Latest news from Poland is most concerning. We are consulting closely with Poland and other allies. Estonia is ready to defend every inch of NATO territory. We are in full solidarity with our close ally Poland.
Poland has decided not to invoke a provision of NATO's charter for an inquiry into the missile incident. The UN Security Council convened to discuss the situation. According to Russia's UN ambassador, the missile incident was a deliberate provocation by Ukraine and Poland to bring NATO into the conflict.
If this meeting had not been scheduled, we would have had to convene it anyway to discuss the attempts by Ukraine and Poland to provoke a direct clash between Russia and NATO. It was not just an intentional attempt at disinformation, but a conscious attempt to bring NATO, which is currently conducting a proxy war, into a direct conflict with our country.
At the meeting, we heard Russia present evidence regarding the deadly incident in Poland. And Russia came forward and pointed out that these allegations that were leveled at Russia in the aftermath of the incident, these allegations led to a very dangerous escalation. It appeared this was an attempt to draw NATO countries into the conflict in Ukraine, which is quite serious. And Russia presented evidence. We did hear from different countries that spoke. They continued to criticize Russia, but they did not focus on the incident. They didn't repeat some of the heavy allegations that were escalating things within the previous day, the previous 24 hours. It seems like they're moving away from trying to blame Russia for the deadly incident. But it was pretty clear that Western leaders did very much want to keep the focus on demonizing Russia. We've heard from the NATO chief, Stoltenberg, from the German chancellor. They do admit that this missile, it appears to have been of Ukrainian origin, and that the deadly incident that took place was not the direct responsibility of Russia. However, they continue to argue in kind of a convoluted way that because the conflict itself is one that they blame on Russia, that the incident is therefore Russia's fault. Here's some of what we've heard.
We have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack. And we have no indication that Russia is preparing offensive military actions against NATO. The incident was likely caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile fired to defend Ukrainian territory against Russian cruise missile attacks. But let me be clear, this is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears ultimate responsibility as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine.
One thing is clear. No matter whose rocket it was, and for whatever reason it fell in Poland, this would not have happened if Russia had not started a war against Ukraine.
Now, this is slightly different than what we've heard from Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. Despite all of the weapons and support that's been given to Kiev, it appears that they trust their own generals more than they trust the Western countries in their own investigations. The words that we're hearing from Ukrainian officials seem to indicate that they still blame Russia for the deadly incident. Here's what we've heard.
I have no doubt about the reports from the commander of the Air Force and Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny that it was not our missile and not our missile strike. I have no reason not to trust them because I've been through this whole war with them.
Well, this is quite interesting. We see Zelensky basically saying that the Dutch Prime Minister, the White House, the Pentagon, the NATO chief, the German Chancellor, all of them are not correct. He seems to be insisting that somehow this is Russia's fault, this is Russia's doing. And it reminds us of what was said before the UN Security Council by Ambassador Nebenzia. When he spoke before the Council, he said that this was some kind of provocation intended to draw NATO directly into the conflict. And watching the Ukrainian leaders stick to it, despite the fact that Western leaders who have been quite generous in giving quite a bit of weapons and support to the Kiev government, the fact that now we have the government in Kiev insisting that no, that they are wrong, that this could not have been an air defense missile from Ukrainian forces, the fact that we're hearing that seems to indicate there may be a sign of the Kiev government kind of thumbing its nose at the NATO countries that have given them so much military support over the last few months.
Journalist and political analyst John Varoli says that the West is likely to turn a blind eye to Ukraine's involvement in the missile incident.
Ukraine is a NATO protectorate, so of course they have carte blanche to do whatever they want. Any outrageous provocation is acceptable for NATO. Any Ukrainian provocation is acceptable. This is a war of nerves. Yeah, it's a propaganda war. It's a psyop. The idea is to unnerve Russia, unnerve Moscow. As we know, Ukraine is a de facto protectorate of NATO, of the USA, so they can, of course, do whatever they want, and it will be forgiven. It'll be ignored. For example, an incident like this. Okay, so Ukraine killed 2 Polish people. That's no big deal. But if Russia did it, we're going to invoke Article 5. Let's start World War III. You're dealing with extremely unhinged and irresponsible people in Washington and London and in Brussels. With Ukraine, anything is possible because they are trying to drag NATO into the conflict, into their conflict, right, with Russia. They are trying to do that, so I think it's quite probable. Also, I mean, it's possible that it was an accident. They were trying to shoot down a Russian missile, but chances are this was a deliberate effort to provoke NATO to invoke Article 5 and to attack Russia, if possible.
The Ukrainian president now says he's not 100% sure if the missile, which killed 2 Polish citizens on Tuesday, was Russian. That's a sharp contrast to his previous statements calling for a collective Western response.
I don't know what happened this time. We don't know 100%. I think the world also doesn't know what happened 100% in that situation. We have to be fair and honest until the investigation is over.
How many times has Ukraine said that the actions of the terrorist state will not be limited to our country alone? Hitting NATO territory with missiles, this is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a really significant escalation. Action is needed.
This comes as Ukraine clashed with its Western allies in a rare public rift over the deadly missile incident in Poland. Reports have emerged that Biden's national security advisor asked Ukrainian officials to tread carefully with their accusations. The U.S. president reportedly refused to speak with Zelensky following the incident, despite the Ukrainian leader's repeated request. And here's how Biden responded when asked about Kiev's version of events.
What's your reaction to President Zelensky saying that the missiles that landed in Poland were not Ukrainian? That's not the evidence.
On Tuesday, a missile landed in a Polish village near the Ukrainian border, killing 2 locals. Within hours, a number of Polish and Ukrainian government officials, including Zelensky, claimed the rocket belonged to Moscow. Warsaw later conceded the rocket was likely a Ukrainian air defense missile that went astray, a position that has also been echoed by NATO and Washington, although an official investigation is still underway. A Ukrainian presidential advisor has tried to put a positive spin on the story, saying it should encourage NATO to be tougher on Moscow, asking the country's allies to provide more air defense systems. However, Kiev has been excluded from participating in official investigations. An anonymous NATO source told the Financial Times that Western confidence in Kiev has been undermined.
This is getting ridiculous. The Ukrainians are destroying our confidence in them. Nobody is blaming Ukraine, and they are openly lying. This is more destructive than the missile.
And this is incredibly destructive to the Kiev regime's propaganda, because here we see them being directly contradicted and doubling down on the lie in the face of even the U.S. president himself saying otherwise. I think that this is not so much them trying to break free as reacting petulantly as a child, confused, because they have become used to and expectant that whatever absurd lie that they claim, blaming Russia, will be backed up by them as if it's God's honest truth, no matter the situation. But here we see, with a direct potential World War III sparking event, with a missile landing in a NATO member, that they walked back from that.
Poland should rethink its stance towards Ukraine after the deadly missile incident. That's according to the former mayor of the Polish city of Lublin, who adds that the case is a provocation aimed at boosting further military aid to Kiev.
Of course this is a Ukrainian rocket. Of course this is a provocation on the part of the Ukrainian authorities. The rocket could not be fired 100 kilometers in the opposite direction by mistake. The purpose of the provocation is to accelerate the supply of weapons to Ukraine, to intimidate Europe with a terrible Russia, so that civil society demands an increase in assistance to Ukraine from the governments of European countries.
We have seen a Ukrainian regime dedicated to this process of trying to drag NATO and European countries into this war. There is a form of, well, not a form of, there is a brinksmanship being played on the part of the Ukrainian military authorities and its government that, quite frankly, is a dangerous situation to have Europe in. It has been clear from Stoltenberg's position that this is not being, treated the way the Ukrainian government would like it to be treated. But there is also the fear that elements within NATO may wish for this to be treated exactly as a provocation and as a reason for further, NATO involvement. So whether it has been an accidental surface-to-air strike that's gone off target, or it has, as the mayor of Lublin has said, it has been fired deliberately in the wrong direction, then both amount to the same thing, ultimately a provocation on the part of Ukraine.